Thick clouds rolled over a fat moon. A dingy station wagon traced a curvy road. Leaves clung hopelessly to the trees. Jackie had her feet up on the dashboard as Daniel flipped through radio stations. A garbled news bulletin recited grim reports. The next channel was playing November Rain by Guns N' Roses. Nick perked up in the back seat.
Oh yeah, GNR! I don't really like the new album. It's not near as good as Appetite.
Daniel said. Still, the song kept playing.
How much further is this place?
Jackie rolled the window down more.
The flyer said it was the only house on Hill Road.
Daniel was an attentive driver.
The Forever Road.
Nick tried his best ghostly voice.
Shouldn't we have costumes?
Daniel asked.
Geez, we're not babies.
Nick fired.
I have this.
Jackie exclaimed, and started digging through her purse. She withdrew a pen that had dripping red blood designs down the side, and held the small container up in the air like a trophy.
Oh, what is it? Lipstick?
Nick asked with a disinterested tone.
It's blood. Blood stick.
Jackie offered.
And we'd be zombies or vampires or whatever.
Jackie lowered her arm and popped the cap off.
I'm not wearing no lipstick,
Nick said, sitting back in his seat and crossing his arms defiantly.
Bro, did you just do a double negative?
Daniel laughed. A loud bang sent the car swerving. Daniel gripped the wheel tightly. Jackie screamed, and Nick cussed.
What the fuck was that?
They came to a screeching stop in the shade of a large oak tree.
What was that?
Nick shouted. Daniel's hands were still on the wheel. Jackie put a hand on his shoulder, and he loosened up. Nick was swiveling around in his seat to look out the back window.
Something in the road. We blew a tire.
Daniel swung his door open and stepped out.
I don't see anything.
Nick started. But Jackie was already getting out of the car, too. They circled the vehicle, inspecting the damage. Both tires on the passenger side were flat, almost shredded. The tree above them rustled leaves down on their heads with a breeze.
How did that even happen?
Jackie asked.
I don't know. I guess it doesn't matter.
Daniel started walking down the road in the direction they were going.
Yo, where you going?
Nick asked, as he stepped out of the back seat.
I'm gonna go find help. You guys coming?
Daniel shoved his hands in his pockets. Jackie was already following him. Nick hesitated for a moment, but after an uncertain glance up and down the road, hurried along. The moon hung heavy above them. Ahead, the path snaked and curled into a thicket of trees. Unlike the solitary giant fading behind them, most of the leaves had already fallen from these. They were dry and crooked, the kind of trees seen on Halloween gift cards.
Are you sure you want to go this way?
Nick's voice was as uneasy as his darting eyes.
What choice is there? What was the last house we saw? Or anything?
Daniel walked at a brisk pace.
Miles and miles,
Jackie affirmed.
Yeah, but spooky trees.
Nick tried. Silence fell over them as they entered into the shadow oasis. Their footsteps crunched the red and orange leaves that covered the pavement. The light of the moon nearly evaporated in the cemetery of a grove, even with their bare branches.
See? These trees are spooky as...
Nick was cut off by a sudden flurry of high-pitched yelping. It sounded maniacal, inhuman, like dogs cackling. There was one long howl in the midst of chattering yips and cries. The noise seemed to be all around them, echoing through the woods. Before anyone knew what they were doing, they were all in a full sprint. Nick quickly raced out ahead, flying down the road like a track star. Jackie was close behind him, and Daniel struggled to keep up.
Wait, don't leave me!
Daniel shouted, as the sounds seemed to get closer. Nick burst into an opening where the trees abruptly stopped. Jackie hung at the end of the shade, waiting for Daniel.
What was that?
He panted, collapsing to the moonlit pavement. Nick helped him up.
Come on. It's not like we're safe because we're out of the woods. Besides, look.
Daniel pulled his head up to see an incredible but dilapidated mansion directly ahead of them. It was oversized to its surroundings, looming high above the smatterings of brush and big empty spaces around it. It looked like a Gothic manor, with shuttered windows, overgrown weeds, and a broken stone path, slinking up through a dead garden to chapel doors. The three friends dragged themselves up to a falling rusted gate.
We aren't seriously going in there, are we?
Jackie's eyes were wide.
What choice is there? Go back in the woods? Besides, this has to be the place, right?
Daniel was regaining some of his composure. The gate swung open with a moan. On the way through the yard, they passed crumbling statues and a murky fountain covered in moss. As they got closer, the faint sound of music reached from within the house.
See? Sounds like a party.
Nick beamed.
Yeah, but where is everyone? Where are all the cars and idiots running around the yard?
Jackie asked. Monstrous knockers on the door were in the shape of gargoyle heads. With a glance to the others, Daniel pulled one back and hammered it.
This place is awesome!
Nick whispered. The door swung open, and they all recoiled in horror. Inside, a ravenous party roared. Witches, werewolves, zombies, and creatures of all kinds roamed around jovially, drinks in hand and games underway. The man in the doorway wore a long cape with a red interior and a pendant around his neck. Sharp fangs glistened when he spoke.
Look, everyone! Our guests have arrived. Hello, friends. I bid you welcome.
Their screams were lost beneath the howling moon. There were tables of junk and treasure from one side of the room to the other. An oasis of artifacts, furniture, baseball cards, clothes, toys, jewelry, bottles, clocks, beanie babies, sports equipment, movies, handmade crafts, license plates, and an endless confetti of ceramic statues and seasonal decorations. In the back, there was a row of food vendors, popcorn, pretzels, corn dogs, and a fancy pop-up cart that had funnel cake and lemonade. A shadow-stained outline marked the spot where there had once been a self-serve cotton candy machine. Billy Haynes wandered through the maze of a market with his hand in his mother's. He was a little old for that sort of thing at 10, but the crowds were thick, and he all too well remembered the time that he was lost and found his way into a dark booth in the back. It was the size of a few booths, actually. The whole far corner of the room tented and curtained. Drapes and stretched fabric walls formed a little hut over the space of a few tables. A sign outside said, "Palm readings and crystal ball fortunes." Billy wasn't interested in either one and didn't have money if he had been. He just stopped to notice the way the surrounding sound was stifled out, choked to nothing in the deep recesses of shadow inside. While he stared, he felt himself drifting slowly, subconsciously into the mouth of the tent. The air seemed cooler, and his vision tunneled into the thick darkness. Then, as a buzz began to hum in his ears, he felt a strong hand grip his arm and pull him out. The man was inconceivably large to Billy, his huge, scarred hand wrapped around Billy's bicep like a snake on a branch. He was so tall, Billy could hardly see his face, obscured by height, the angle, and the overhead lights that haloed his head.
Little boys should now be here.
The man's voice was as gravelly as his appearance. Billy didn't need to be told twice and ran screaming all through the flea market. His mom had to pick him up from the staff offices after he ended up there in a hysterical haze he could hardly remember. He sobbed as she told him it was time to leave, and that they couldn't stop for the Jurassic Park toy on the way out. Later, when he calmed down, Billy was able to better explain to his mom what happened. His animated description of the old witch's cave only furthered his mother's suspicion that he was making too much of the whole thing. She told him that the man was right. He had no business there and that the man was probably just trying to scare him so that he wouldn't come back. If that had been the plan, it was wildly successful, seeing as how Billy went to great lengths to make sure he didn't have to return to the flea market for a long time afterward. He came up with whatever he could, staying at a friend's house, a day trip to see his grandparents, a fake cold on the third weekend, month after month. When he knew his mom went to the market, he even thought of joining the soccer team, but so detested the idea that this month he finally found himself back in the dusty labyrinth. Today, Billy gripped his mother's hand so hard that she had to pull it loose and shake it free, and he could see the red marks outlining where his fingers had been. As soon as they entered the large central room, he was peering over tables and through traffic to see if he could glimpse the tent in the back corner. He couldn't see through the trove of farmhouse antiquities and baseball bobbleheads, and started to feel a rising dread, a swell of anxiety as they passed up and down the aisles, closer and closer to the back corner of the room. When they entered the final row, the air seemed colder, and Billy felt a pressure in his head. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but as they pressed on, passing by effigies of forgotten advertising mascots and clouded glass soda bottles with old worn labels, Billy's vision began to flicker. It seemed like everything around him was fading out, gently extinguishing into darkness. Billy turned to his mom and opened his mouth, but she was already gone too. There was nothing around him. He had sunk into a void, passed through some invisible door to an empty space. He turned and ran back the way he had come, but the silent shadows stretched out forever in front of him. He tried to call out, but couldn't even hear himself, muffled by the blank nothingness. Then he heard a noise behind him. Painful creaks that sounded like rusty bones snapping into place, and a rattle like a snake. Billy looked back and saw the outline of a little old woman, hunched over and draped in ragged cloth. A shawl over her head obscured her face. But as Billy watched, a small flame grew in her cupped hand and illuminated her features. Her skin seemed to be melting off her, running and dripping like wet paint. Sharp cheekbones seemed ready to poke through the muddy mess, and a wide grin revealed crooked and jagged teeth that made Billy picture the rows of tombstones in his local cemetery. He tried to scream, but didn't make a sound, and then he heard her laugh, a mean gurgling sound that echoed all around him. She was getting closer, but neither of them were moving. The blank space seemed to be pulling them together.
Little boys should not be here.
The voice was hers, but not human. Billy stood outside the tent, staring into its darkness, tears running down his face, and his mouth hanging open. His mother pleaded with him to say something. Dennis Rote waited at the stop sign, his eyes fixed on the woman in the black Jeep at the intersection. She looked just exactly like his wife, Katie, but he knew Katie was at home. He had just left there, and she hadn't driven a black Jeep in more than 10 years. Still, this woman was identical, with her curly black hair and short bangs, close-set eyes, and pencil lips. And as she pulled through the crossing, carefully measuring the angle with his car as she passed, Dennis noticed that she even had the same port wine-stained birthmark on her left cheek. Dennis was so flustered and confused that he just sat there at the stop for a minute after she was gone. Finally, headlights behind him spurred him to motion, and he tried to call Katie, but she didn't answer. He wanted to tell her about the strange coincidence, but if he was being honest with himself, he was also checking to see if she was still at home. He drove down the quiet road completely wrapped in his head, ignoring the sad electronic music on the radio, past the murmuring brook, through the forlorn tunnel of trees with dead winter branches. He pulled up to the next intersection, opposite a red hatchback that looked exactly like the one his mom drove. Unable to resist, he peered in as he drove by them. And without question, the woman was the striking image of his mother, who lived on the other side of the country in California. Now Dennis was worried, feeling his heart rate elevate, wondering if he could have somehow gone insane in the 10 minutes since he left home. The ramshackle houses might as well not even been there as he went by, the dilapidating scenery blurring to a haze in his distracted mind. The odds of such a coincidence were incomprehensible, and he was a sensitive, suggestible type anyway. At the next four-way stop, he waited for a gray sports car to ease to a halt. It was just like the one his friend Alex had. The car Alex had driven into the James River 2 years before, either on purpose or in a just as purposeful boozed stupor. The windows were tinted, the same as Alex's, so he was unable to identify any driver but sat there until the car gently pulled away. He tried to call Katie again, but there was still no answer. Considering who else to call, it suddenly shot through him that he didn't know where he was going or why he had left. A confusing wave of fear overtook him as he questioned everything. He thought he remembered walking at the door and casually driving through his little subdivision, but now as he focused on it, the memory seemed to fade. Like a dream in the morning, he could not recall any motivation or destination, and he suddenly felt very lost, alone, and frightened. Making a U-turn in the intersection, he resolved to just go home. But immediately, even though he drove straight back to the way he came, things weren't the same. The road kept stretching on, never coming to the previous intersection he had just crossed. As he kept pressing forward, the broken little houses never came. The trees and brooks didn't appear. The road only went onward into darkness, the surroundings now bare of any recognizable scenery. Dennis called 911, believing that whatever was happening, he was in some kind of trouble. But no one answered. He hadn't known that was even possible. And now questioning his whole mental state, he pulled over to the side of the road, taking a few deep breaths. He wondered if he should start walking in different directions. Surely there had to be something somewhere close. He couldn't have gotten himself that lost in however long it had been since he left. Then he noticed approaching headlights and recognized that he hadn't seen any traffic save for the 3 vehicles from his past. As the little orbs grew closer, his head began to swim with possibilities. The lights were small, almost emotive circles, the type that were on his father's vintage Chevrolet pickup truck, the one that co-starred in half the pictures of his dad he had never seen. It had already been an antique back then, and Dennis had heard a million times how much the truck had meant to his dad, and how much he loved working on it. His mom had to sell it after his death to help cover the hospital and funeral costs. Dennis shivered and felt a cold shadow in his body as the truck passed, ambiguous in the cover of night. He started to cry and picked up his phone, quickly attempting to send text messages that just said, "Please, help," to multiple people. But he had no connection, and they all stalled, losing himself to beat his hands on the steering wheel and screamed. Choral music entered lowly through the speakers, and it occurred to Dennis that it had been quiet for a while. The music from before had dissipated without him noticing. The unprompted hymn rose in volume and enveloped the car. It was bright and holy, but still somehow ominous, reminding Dennis of candlelit Christmas vigils he had attended as a kid. Despite the panic from the unexplained intrusion, it began to soothe Dennis, knowing that he had lost all control. The song boomed deafeningly as he closed his eyes, retreating inward and resigning himself to what was happening. He felt warmth on his face and imagined the beaming sun welcoming him in, the gates of heaven opening wide, and a crowd of familiar faces greeting him with love and excitement. Then there was the sound of crashing metal, of pieces being pulled apart, cries and screams, and Dennis felt cold. Everything went dark, but the voices were still singing. Angel voices lost on the empty road.